She walked down the aisle in a plain silk dress, no title, no entourage, no diamonds, just a chipped ring and a silence that unsettled the elite. The guests sneered, the mother-in-law objected, and the maid of honor, his glamorous ex, tried to humiliate her in front of the world. They called her a nobody, a charity case, a mistake. But when the priest paused and revealed her true name, Princess Alina Thalassa Evangeline Renwind, heir to a dynasty that funds the world's central bank, the cathedral fell silent. What followed was not just a wedding, but a reckoning. One by one, the powerful fell, and the woman they tried to bury became the crown they never saw coming. Stay until the end. Justice has never worn humility. So, the bells of Valamount Cathedral tolled through the gray April sky, their echoes trailing down cobbled streets like a royal proclamation. Yet not one guest inside paused to honor their solemn beauty. All eyes were fixed elsewhere. She had arrived not in a velvet carriage, not on the arm of a herald, but alone, stepping softly across the marble threshold, as if the grandest cathedral in Eisendorf were nothing more than a garden gate. Her name on the invitation had been simple, Alina Thalassa. No surname, no title, no crest embossed in gold. And that to the congregation of diplomats, financiers, and blue-blooded legacies was an offense, a challenge to their rules, and in their eyes perhaps a mistake. Her gown didn't shimmer, it whispered. It was soft, white silk, unbranded, unembroidered, unbothered by trends. It draped her form with a grace that needed no corset, no crystals. Around her finger was a ring, old silver chipped, the kind only a daughter would wear, in memory. Not luxury. Her hair, chestnut and unstyled, fell in loose waves held back by a tarnished silver clip. No stylist in sight. No designer claim. She moved like someone accustomed to silence, like someone who had attended thousands of rooms where people spoke about her without knowing her name. And in this room where champagne breathed like perfume, and every heel click echoed like a power move, her stillness was an offense all its own. Where are her bridesmaids, whispered a countess, her satin sleeves trembling in theatrical disbelief. No crimson carpet, scoffed a politician's wife, nose wrinkled as if royalty should arrive with a drum roll. At the altar, Damien Everhart, son of the Everhart Consortium, the global titan behind defense systems and diplomatic leverage, stood waiting, tall, poised, unreadable, in a black tailored tuxedo that whispered military precision. His green eyes met hers across the cathedral, and for a moment, a hush. He offered his hand, she took it. The gesture, simple and silent, should have spoken volumes. But in this cathedral of expectation and tradition, it only deepened the mystery. Who was this woman? A rumor crawled through the velvet pews like smoke. She worked in a bakery. Another said she was a gardener's daughter from the Thalassa coast. A third, more scandalous, a charity case Damien had foolishly taken under his wing. She doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, muttered a teenage aristocrat phone already out, trying to catch the perfect unflattering angle. She looks like she stitched her dress from attic curtains, whispered Serafina, Marlowe, Damien's ex and maid of honor, her voice sharp enough to cut silk. Her crimson gown shimmered, her smile didn't. And through it all, Alina said nothing. She did not adjust her gown. She did not offer a forced smile. Her hazel eyes remained steady, not defiant, but something deeper, something unshaken, as if she knew that silence when held long enough could become thunder. And above her, the chandeliers glittered, not with approval, but with cold reflection. She stood at the altar, not as a bride to be admired, but a woman under siege, and she didn't flinch. The weight of 1,000 gazes pressed against her silk-covered shoulders as Alina stood beside Damien, not held, not embraced, but examined. Every breath she took was measured against the expectations of a world she'd never asked to enter. The cathedral air, once heavy with incense and solemnity, now bristled with quiet cruelty. Lady Vivian Everhart, Damien's mother, sat in the front pew like a monarch without a throne, her posture stiff, her silver gown immaculately pressed. Her icy blue eyes scanned Alina, not with curiosity, but with appraisal. Or perhaps appraisal would have been kind. What gleamed in her gaze was something colder, rejection dressed as restraint. "We invited heads of state," she whispered to the Earl of Selborne, her voice a thread of silk hiding steel, "and he brings the help." The Earl chuckled behind his glove. 2 rows behind them, the murmurs grew bolder. "No, Last name, someone said. No. Title, no. LinkedIn. Another added laughter laced with disdain. A cluster of financiers, all patent leather shoes and pocket squares, leaned together. One sipped champagne before murmuring, "A blank slate. She could be anyone, which means she's probably no one. She's here for the money." Another whispered Everhart Consortium's billions would attract anyone desperate enough to fake grace. And then, of course, there was Serafina, draped in molten gold, lips slashed red. She radiated the kind of confidence that only came from generations of being told she deserved the world. As Alina passed by earlier, Serafina had leaned just close enough to be heard and just loud enough to wound. "Are you sure Damien knows who you are?" she asked, voice like honey over thorns. The question wasn't just for Alina, it was for the audience, for the cameras, for the gossip columns, already drafting headlines. Now standing behind Alina with a perfect posture and poisonous smile, Serafina let her fingers trail along the bouquet. She held a symbol of what she believed should have been hers. "She's a ghost," she whispered to the Duchess of Rhinewell. "No past, no pedigree, not even an Instagram following," the Duchess chuckled. "Perhaps she's part of some social experiment, Damien's project of the year." Even fashion editors joined the fray. In the fifth pew, a woman from Haute Royale jotted in a velvet notebook, "Dress off rack, clip dollar bin, no signature scent detected." One influencer live-streamed the event. "Okay, I'm just saying, this is fashion homicide. Who shows up at Valemount Cathedral, in thrift store, silk?" And all the while, Alina remained silent. No tears, no rebuttal, no glance at her critics, just the steady rise and fall of her breath, just the chipped ring glinting faintly as the organ hummed a distant note. If her silence unnerved them, they didn't show it. Yet something beneath the marble and velvet was beginning to shift, barely visible like a gathering wind before a storm, because not every storm begins with thunder. Some begin with a woman choosing not to bend. The ceremony hadn't even begun, and already Alina Thalassa had become the centerpiece of a masquerade. She never asked to join, not of masks, but of polished cruelty. Every glance, every chuckle masked in napkins, every whispered insult behind jeweled fingers was aimed like a dagger. And the daggers kept coming. She had barely taken her place at the altar when it happened. Serafina Marlowe, in a masterstroke of feigned clumsiness, stepped forward, her golden gown cascading like liquid wealth. And as she passed behind Alina, her heel caught on the hem of Alina's gown. A sharp tear, soft but unmistakable. The whisper of silk parting beneath strain echoed louder than the organ's lull. Serafina gasped theatrically and clutched her chest as though she'd broken a relic. "Oh, darling," she cooed, her voice pitched just high enough for the first 5 pews to hear. "Your gown's unraveling already. Such fragile fabric." A ripple of laughter spread across the congregation. Not the bold, belly-deep kind, but the cruel, restrained kind that lives in elite circles. The kind that makes itself small so it can hide behind civility. Alina didn't flinch. She reached down calmly, smoothed the torn edge, and stood again with the same quiet grace. But the mockery didn't stop there. A passing server, likely goaded by whispered dares from a group of young aristocrats near the side, Chapel stumbled beside her, splashing a deep red wine dangerously close to the hem of her dress. A gasp swept the room. The stain didn't land directly. It grazed, but the symbolism was there. Red against white, a taint, a mark, a message. The aristocrats burst into soft, calculated laughter. One of them, a boy no older than 20, with a loosened silk tie, leaned toward his companion. "Bet she's the gardener's daughter," he whispered. "If not the gardener herself." His companion nodded. "She wears poverty like perfume." A viscountess' fingers heavy with diamonds pointed at Alina's ring. "That chip," she said, voice, like silk soaked in venom. "Did she fish it out of a pawn shop?" Her friends giggled. Their laughter didn't echo. It clung like humidity, like judgment. Even the fashion critics had rejoined that clip in her hair. One hissed, styled in a barn. "I swear." A blogger with 1 million followers streamed live commentary from the aisle. "She is wearing a crime scene. This is couture sacrilege." Her camera zoomed in on the torn seam Serafina had caused. "Oh yes," confirmed, Valemount wedding, already a meme, and in the center of it all, Alina stood still. Unmoved, the taunts lashed her like whips, each insult meant to cut a piece of her away. But they underestimated her silence. They mistook stillness for surrender. What they couldn't see was what flickered just beneath her quiet. A storm that had not yet spoken, but would soon. The organ fell into a breathless pause. A hush swept across Valamount Cathedral, not reverent, but sharpened like a blade being drawn. Even the chandeliers suspended like constellations in the vaulted ceiling seemed to dim under the weight of what was about to unfold. At the altar, Alina Thalassa stood alone in her plain silk gown, fingers gently adjusting the torn edge near her hip, a small, deliberate gesture that betrayed nothing of the storm churning behind her steady hazel eyes. Across from her, Damien Everhart remained still, his jaw tight. He had not said a word since they'd stood beneath the stained glass arch together, but his silence was different, not the silence of submission, but one of calculation. Watchful, ready. Then the priest stepped forward. Father Laurent Ambrose, draped in black ceremonial robes with silver embroidery, only worn for noble unions, opened his ancient book with the gravity of history. Before we proceed, he said, voice echoing across marble and ego, I am bound by tradition to ask, does anyone object to this union? A pause, a breath, then rustling silk, the scrape of heels, the unsheathing of arrogance. Two figures rose at once. First, Seraphina, Marlowe, her golden gown gleaming like false virtue. A microphone previously hidden in her clutch slid into her manicured hand with practiced ease. I object, she said, her voice confident, loud enough to claim the cathedral itself. This union is a mistake. Gasps rippled through the crowd like falling dominoes. Second lady, Vivian Everhart, Damien's mother, stood beside Seraphina, her silver gown as severe as the chill in her voice. If Alina truly cared for Damien, she said, addressing the congregation like a magistrate, she would never have let him walk into disgrace. The word disgrace landed like a slap. Some guests turned away in discomfort. Others leaned in hungry for more. The whisper storm reignited instantly. This is it, someone muttered. The family's putting an end to it. She won't recover from this. She'll be escorted out before the vows. The teens near the side chapel who'd earlier mocked her ring and hair now began recording again their excitement, a cruel undercurrent. Even the organist's fingers trembled above the keys. But Alina didn't move. Her spine remained straight, her hands calmly folded, as if she'd seen this moment coming long before they did. As if this entire cathedral, its judgment, its cruelty, its venom was playing a role she had quietly assigned them in her silence. Across the aisle, Damien's eyes locked onto hers. No fear, no surprise. Only a single steady truth passed between them. They expected her to break, but she was waiting, because she knew something no one else did. And in the space between silence and scandal, the storm began to turn. The silence inside Valamount Cathedral turned glacial, sharp, brittle, as if even sound itself had been warned not to breathe too loudly. Seraphina stood tall in gold, the picture of confidence, while Lady Vivian Everhart tightened her grip on a pearl-encrusted clutch, her face carved from marble. Together, they faced the altar like judges handing down a sentence. The crowd waited for the bride to flee, or at least falter. Alina Thalassa did neither. Instead, it was Father Laurent Ambrose who moved. Closing his ceremonial book with a firm thud, he stepped down from the dais, not toward Damien, not toward Vivienne, but toward Alina. There was something solemn in his movement, something reverent. Before we continue, he said, his voice quieter now, yet every syllable seemed to ring louder than Seraphina's objection. I must honor a formal request received by this cathedral from a royal house recognized by the European Sovereign Accord. Gasps sparked like flint. A request. The priest continued, his eyes not leaving Alina to confirm the true identity of the bride standing before us. The whispers halted, phones lowered, every breath was bated. He gently reached for Alina's hand. She offered it. Then, raising his voice just enough to reach the farthest vaulted corners of the cathedral, he said, Princess Alina Thalassa Evangeline Renwind, legal heir to the Renwind dynasty, one of the 3 sovereign families who fund the World Central Banking Council. A silence fell that was not still but stunned. shattered. A name that didn't just open doors, it governed them. The crowd froze. The financiers who had chuckled earlier now stared pale and blinking. The influencers stopped their live streams mid-sentence. Even the fashion editors lowered their pens. The hashtag #NoshBrideFail died in the same breath it had flourished. At the back of the cathedral, where the guests had paid little attention, 4 figures rose from their gilded chairs. A tall man in full military dress, uniform medals gleaming. A veiled woman in a violet gown with the posture of a legacy. 2 royal youths beside them, a boy and a girl whose silence now felt like thunder. They did not need to introduce themselves. They were the Renwinds, and they were no longer waiting in the shadows. The man, unmistakably King Aldrich Renwind, removed his white gloves and began walking down the aisle, each step measured like a declaration. When he reached the altar, he faced the crowd. "I am here," he said, his voice unyielding, "to return my daughter to her throne." The veiled woman bowed her head. Queen Isolde. The royal guards behind them unfurled a massive banner embroidered with the Renwind crest gold thread on storm blue velvet. It swept across the aisle like a wave of reckoning. Then one of the guards in full regalia stepped forward, bowed low before Alina, and said, with a voice heavy with honor, "Your Highness, forgive us. We were late in silencing the disgrace." Seraphina's smile cracked. Lady Vivian paled. The pews turned from whispers to stunned silence, the crowd unsure whether to kneel or disappear. But one thing was now undeniable. The girl in the plain silk dress was no ghost. She was royalty, and the cathedral belonged to her. The silence that followed the reveal was different. It wasn't cruel. It was terrified. The same guests who'd whispered, mocked, and live-streamed their contempt now sat as still as carved statues, the kind that suddenly feared being shattered. Princess Alina Thalassa Evangeline Renwind stood unchanged at the altar. Same gown, same chipped ring, same steady eyes. But everything around her had transformed. No longer the unknown girl, no longer the help. Now she was the daughter of a monarch who could unmake economies with a single signature. And King Aldrich Renwind was not finished. The monarch turned from the guests to face the front pew, where Lady Vivian Everhart sat in cold disbelief, her spine taut against the velvet cushion. "I came here in silence," the king said, "because my daughter wished for her wedding to be hers, not a coronation. But I can no longer stay quiet." His voice echoed like the toll of justice. He turned to the guests, many of whom were titans of trade, media barons and foreign dignitaries. "The Renwind dynasty," he declared, "does not simply wear crowns. It holds the arteries of global finance. Every institution you pride yourselves on, every loan, every line of credit, every campaign donation, every endowment that funds your reputation, it all runs through our name." A collective inhale swept the cathedral. In the front row, a banking magnate turned a shade paler. His wife clutched his arm. Behind them, a tech mogul who had moments earlier called Alina a ghost checked his phone beneath his jacket, his fingers trembling. His company's liquidity is tied directly to Renwind investment. He looked up stricken, one of Alina's cousins, the young prince. Elias stepped forward, his posture regal, voice even. "Our cousin has funded your galas," he said coolly, pointing toward the aristocrats who had laughed. "Your charities, your peacekeeping missions, the very defense contracts the Everhart Consortium thrives on, were negotiated with her knowledge before she turned 20. The Duchess who mocked Alina's dress clutched her pearls. Lady Vivian, usually so composed, whispered hoarsely, "That's not possible," but it was. And the Renwind guards were already moving one-handed, a silver tablet to King Aldrich, who held it aloft. Live data appeared on the cathedral's projection screen. One by one, graphs and charts displayed the financial underpinnings of the room's most powerful guests, their debts, obligations, partnerships, all connected to Renwind banks. The silence cracked. Someone in the sixth pew dropped a champagne glass. Seraphina, Marlowe took a half step back. Her perfect crimson lips lost their curve. A ripple went through her as her mind caught up her luxury jewelry empire, financed through Renwind bonds. King Aldrich turned to her, not with anger, but with icy precision. "You mocked a princess," he said, "who holds the loans on your empire." She opened her mouth, but no sound came. The screen blinked again. Marlowe Lux. Holdings under investigation, stock plummeting. The camera flashes ceased, the live streams ended, because suddenly, no one wanted their face tied to the ridicule that had just become treasonous in tone. And at the center of it all, Alina stood quietly, her hands folded, her chipped ring gleaming not as an imperfection, but as a symbol of where she'd come from, of what she had chosen to hide, and of what she was no longer willing to forgive. Panic wears a sharp scent. Not fear exactly, but a sour blend of sweat and realization. It drifted now through Valamount Cathedral like a rising fog. The projected screen still aglow, above the altar displayed plummeting stock tickers. Marlowe Lux Holdings, 32%, and falling red lines bled across every name tied to the Renwind financial network. And in this cathedral, that meant nearly everyone. Guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, backs straighter, shoulders tighter. A fashion editor, once smug in her velvet, quietly shut her notepad. An investment CEO typed frantically on his phone beneath the pew, his expression collapsing by the second. But it was Serafina Marlowe who bore the brunt of the first blow. She staggered backward, gold gown no longer radiant, her confident posture cracking. The woman who'd once orchestrated cruelty now trembled beneath the cathedral lights. I didn't know," she whispered more to herself than anyone else. No replied. Prince Elias, his tone sharp but calm. "You didn't ask." A Renwind guard approached and handed her a second tablet glowing red with headlines from international outlets. Breaking Marlowe, Lux Faces, Renwind Freeze, Immediate Audit Requested, Empire, Unstable Market Reaction, Shock and Exodus. She stared at it, paralyzed. The laughter she'd weaponized earlier had long died. Even her so-called allies now shifted away. One media mogul removing his arm from her chair, another tech influencer deleting their collaborative post in real time. Across the aisle, Lady Vivian Everhart sat ghost-pale, gripping the pew. She looked not at Alina nor at King Aldrich, but at the projection above her, where the Everhart Consortium's international contracts were now being reviewed by Renwind regulators. "I had no idea," she muttered. "I'm sure you didn't," said Queen Isolde Renwind, stepping forward for the first time, her pale violet gown trailing like mist. Her voice was soft, dangerous in its softness. "My daughter rebuilt economies while you discussed whether her dress was designer." A wave of shame rippled through the crowd. One by one, the once mighty began to rise, not in pride, but in submission. A countess who had called Alina a shadow bowed her head. "I was wrong, Your Highness." A billionaire financier who had toasted to Damien's mistake stepped forward, lips dry. "I should never have spoken your name with such ignorance." A baroness who had mocked the chipped ring knelt. "My words were cruel. I ask your forgiveness." It was no longer a wedding. It had become a court, and Alina its sovereign. Still she said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence backed by the crest of the Renwind. Dynasty had become a blade that trimmed away deception with every breath. In the pews, even those who hadn't spoken aloud looked shaken, because they had laughed. They had nodded. They had remained silent when the room tried to shame a sovereign, and now they understood the cost. At the altar, Damien reached for Alina's hand again. She let him take it, and though her eyes remained forward, the press of their palms spoke clearly. Let them feel what they tried to bury. She had ruled rooms like this one for decades. Lady Vivian Everhart, widow of a war baron, mother to the heir of the Everhart Consortium, keeper of ancestral reputation. Her glacial blue eyes had silenced senators. Her signature could tilt political funding. Her approval was currency. But now beneath the cold stares of a royal dynasty, even she looked small. She rose slowly from the front pew, the weight of her silver gown more noticeable than ever. Her voice, when it came, trembled the echo of a woman who just realized her seat at the top had always been borrowed. "I misjudged you," she said, her tone hushed but audible. "Princess." Alina didn't move. She didn't need to. Vivian swallowed hard and glanced at her son. Damien Everhart, who stood tall beside Alina, gave no nod of comfort, only calm resolve. He held Alina's hand tighter now, his stance not of a groom, but of an ally. Vivian turned toward King Aldrich Renwind, who waited like a storm dressed in metals. "My intention was never to insult your house. Yet you did." King Aldrich interrupted, his voice low. "Lethal, you insulted my blood." In front of a world that still owes us interest, the room stilled. Every syllable dropped like a coin into the chest of the cathedral's hush. He gestured to his guard, who stepped forward with a sealed dossier, ornate royal blue, marked with the insignia of the Renwind crown. "Presented here," the king declared, "are the defense contracts signed between Everhart Consortium and our foreign trade councils. A conservative estimate of dependency, 42% of your standing power." He looked her dead in the eye. "You questioned whether my daughter was worthy of your name, Lady Everhart, but tell me, is your house still worthy of hers?" Gasps echoed. No one laughed now. Vivienne's lips parted, but nothing came out. Her eyes widened in slow horror as she glanced back toward her political allies, only to find empty space. The senator who once clung to her social calendar now looked away. The oil tycoon who had cheered her speeches silently slid further down the pew. Even her family's investors, long loyal to her presence, now took out their phones, not to text, but to distance from her, from the sinking Everhart name. Queen Isolde stepped forward again. "We offered silence," she said, her voice as graceful as it was damning. "You answered with scorn. My daughter chose humility. You chose arrogance." She placed a single white-gloved hand over her heart. "And now she finished you. Face the return on that investment." Vivienne's silver gown, once regal, now shimmered like foil beneath judgment. Slowly she lowered herself, not to the floor, not fully, but enough, just enough to mark surrender. A woman who had built her power on perception. Now, kneeling before the truth, Alina said nothing. She only adjusted the clip in her hair, the same tarnished silver piece that Vivienne once mocked, and turned her gaze back toward the priest. The storm had passed her, but it was far from over. The atmosphere inside Valemount Cathedral no longer crackled with whispers or judgment. That electricity once fueled by mockery had shifted. Now it pulsed with something heavier, holier, reverence. The royal crest of house. Renwind hung above the altar like a standard in battle reclaimed. The banner's gold thread shimmered in the overhead light, as if it were woven with lightning itself. But at the center of it all stood Alina, still in the same unadorned gown, the tear at her side carefully mended by one of the Renwind ladies-in-waiting. During the momentary recess, her chipped silver ring still clung to her finger. Now, it didn't look broken. It looked like a relic, the kind of kingdoms is built on. The same guests who had sneered behind champagne glasses were now sitting straight-backed, their hands folded. Some clutched programs like prayer books. Others glanced at their shoes, unable to meet her eyes. Father Laurent Ambrose returned to the altar voice, steadier now, as if he too felt the gravity had changed. "We will now resume," he said, "what was once a wedding, and is now something greater." Alina didn't smile, but she did finally speak, not to the room, to Damien. "Still here?" she asked quietly, her voice soft, not unsure, just intimate. He didn't hesitate. "Always," he replied. Then slowly, almost reverently, Damien Everhart knelt before her. Not for show, not for penance, but for understanding. He took her hand, lifted it to his lips, and kissed the chipped ring. "She never had to be worthy of our name," he said, turning his gaze to the crowd. "We should be asking if we're still worthy of hers." A shiver passed through the cathedral. Some guests looked away. A bridesmaid near the aisle wept silently. Even one of the young Everhart cousins lowered their eyes in guilt. An investor nervously deleted a tweet on his phone, something cruel posted only an hour ago. Now, a liability from the back of the cathedral. Prince Elias and Princess Lysandra. Renwind stood and began walking forward. Their posture was perfect, their steps in harmony, their faces expressionless except for their eyes. When they reached Alina, Elias gave a single respectful bow. "She is our blood," he declared, "and today the world remembers who she is." Then, in a single practiced motion, both royal cousins dropped to one knee, not just for Alina, but in recognition of everything that had transpired. Not far behind them, the Renwind guards saluted in unison, their blades drawn in ceremonial angles across their chests. A duchess stood, then a senator, then an oil baron. Within moments, nearly the entire cathedral, all those who had doubted, mocked, or underestimated her, stood. Some even knelt. The organ swelled again this time, not as prelude but as triumph. Alina turned slightly toward Damien. He looked up at her from where he knelt. "Do you still want to marry me?" she asked, not with sarcasm, but with strength. Damien smiled. "I never wanted anything else." And as Father Ambrose opened his book again, the cathedral, once a theater for scorn, transformed into a coronation hall. The wedding resumed, but this time it wasn't for appearances. It was for truth, and truth in that moment wore no diamonds, only a simple ring, a quiet crown, and a name that no one would ever again forget: Princess Alina Renwind. As Father Laurent Ambrose declared, the union of Princess Alina, Thalassa, Evangeline, Renwind, and Damien Everhart. The words carried not only tradition, they carried restoration. The Renwind banner suspended behind them in its blue and gold brilliance fluttered ever so slightly in the rising draft of the organ's triumphant swell. The cathedral, once the site of whispered cruelty, now resembled a throne room, and its queen had never needed a crown to claim it. The final words left the priest's lips: "I now pronounce you, bonded in legacy and in vow." The audience rose, some clapped, others hesitated, but slowly, undeniably, cheers grew the applause, building not out of habit, but out of sheer stunned reverence. And in that sacred moment, Princess Alina, the girl they once called a servant, a ghost, a joke, stood with Damien beside her, not as someone reclaimed, but as someone who had always been undeniable, Bestfarius. But justice wasn't finished. King Aldrich Renwind stepped forward one last time, the projection screens above flashing again. Not with charts now, but with orders. "Those who slandered my daughter," he said, voice steeled, "will find their influence severed, their alliances voided, their debts collected." And one by one, the consequences rippled outward. A baroness who had laughed at Alina's hair clip wept openly as her family's trade contracts were revoked on screen. A tech mogul pale as marble watched his name drop off the board of a major defense project. His boardroom allies had already abandoned him. Serafina Marlowe Gold, gown, wrinkled lipstick, faded satin, crumpled near the edge of a pew. A guard handed her a tablet. Marlowe Lux Holdings, under audit shareholders, withdraw, assets frozen by royal order. Online her name trended again, but this time not in triumph. Marlowe meltdown, Renwind reckoning. A reporter without royal clearance was escorted out. A group of socialites who had mocked Alina's chipped ring were politely but firmly told, "You're no longer on the guest list." The cathedral emptied, but not in chaos. In correction, like a machine purging its flaws, at Crossbaporst. And at the center of it, all still in the same plain silk gown, stood Alina. No embroidery, no designer label. Just the quiet dignity that had brought an empire to its knees. Her ring, chipped and worn, now gleamed in the light of vindication. Her silence, once mocked, had become a sword. As she and Damien exited the cathedral beneath an arch of raised sabers from the Renwind Royal Guard, the world watched not just those present, but millions online, thousands in the press, and countless in hushed rooms where power was passed in whispers. And they would remember this day, not as a wedding, but as a coronation. Not of diamonds, but of dignity. Not of titles, but of truth. In a world obsessed with status and spectacle, Princess Alina's story is a powerful reminder that dignity doesn't always arrive in diamonds and designer gowns. Sometimes it enters quietly in a chipped ring, a steady gaze, and the kind of silence that shakes empires. What began as public humiliation became a masterclass in restraint, legacy, and poetic justice. The people who mocked her weren't just silenced. They were exposed undone by the very arrogance they wore as armor. This is one of the most extraordinary reversals of power we've ever seen, notes Dr. Marianne Holloway, a royal historian. It wasn't just a wedding. It was the symbolic dismantling of elitism by grace alone. If this story moved you, if you believe in strength without spectacle and justice, served cold but deserved, like, share, and subscribe. Support the channel to help us bring more true and emotionally powerful stories like this to light. Your voice helps elevate voices that were never meant to be silenced.